Okay, I think it's fair to say we can get started. Great attendance. Very exciting to see so many of you joining us today. My name is Thomas Delbar. I work at Supremo now for 2 years. Before I continue with the introductions, I first wanted to go through a very brief housekeeping with you guys. It's going to be a rather concise and short webinar today, our first ever at Supremo, but we'll try and keep it under 20 minutes of presentation, after which I will open to questions and answers. If you'd like to ask any questions at the end of the webinar, there is on the right side normally of your screen a Q&A icon. You just click on it, type your question. Please label your name as accurately as possible so that potentially if we have a lot of questions and I need to get back to some of you by email later, I will then know who to contact to answer to your questions. So let's dive into the topic of today, why organic coffee is expensive and why is it okay that it's expensive? Why this choice of topic? Well, at Supremo, we took a big shift in our business model, in our way of being coffee merchants back in 2014. In that year, we were doing roughly 20% of our book as organic coffee sales. As of 2019, the share of organic transactions in our books has hiked to 40%. So doubled in the space of 5 years. And that is a growth that we really aim at keeping in the company because we firmly believe in the value added of organic coffees, in the relationships that we make over the years by dealing with organic coffees. So that's one of the reasons why we chose this topic today. Personally, as I mentioned earlier, Thomas Delbar, having spent 11 years, the first 11 years of my career in origin countries, namely Peru, Uganda, and Ethiopia, which are 3 coffee growing countries where the presence of organic farming is very important. So that's also why this topic today is a very dear one to my heart and why I accepted to present it to you today. So let's get diving. First, with a look at the organic coffee map. Picture speaks 1,000 words, so does a map in the agricultural world. You can see on this map in yellow most of the organic coffee producing countries. You can see in green the major consuming regions for organic produce in general, but of course for organic coffees, with a specific highlight in red on the USA and on Europe, which absorb, those two combined, absorb more than 90% of organic coffees channeled throughout the world. If we look at those origins in yellow, for a vast majority of them, perhaps with the exception of Honduras, a vast majority of them, organic coffee represents more than 15% of their total production. If we look, for example, at Tanzania, organic coffees represent 37% of their production. It's quite a big chunk. Peru, 28% of their production. Ethiopia, 23%. In East Africa, again, Uganda, for example, organic coffees represent 17.1% of the country's total production. So for all of those origins, growing organic coffee is actually quite a serious thing. All right. We then have Honduras, which is a big volume producer of organic coffees, but for whom those totals do not reach the 15% threshold, well, simply because it is overall a very big producing country. If you add the total organic production from those origins, for whom organic is more than 15%, you reach a figure of 5.7 million bags, quite decent. You then add the production from countries where organic is under 15%, and we reach a total at Supremo of about 7 to 7.2 million bags organic coffee available in the world. If you put that in perspective with the now very well known in the industry coffee barometer of 2018, their figure was 6.1 million bags. So we're quite well higher at 1.1 million bag more, but we will be seeing later in this presentation why that's not a figure we should be taking into account so much, those 7.2 million bags. Let's now jump from this map and go and have a look at what our farmer friends tell us around the organic coffee world. Being an importer that's very connected to origin, we speak daily to farmers around the world, and of recent have been exchanging a lot with them on the topic of organic coffee, organic pricing, the integrity of the organic produce. And we've been collecting quite some feedback from our farmer friends around the world. From the agricultural standpoint, one of the first things that comes into a discussion around organic is the yields. The yields clearly a key to their profitability, but very few cases of productivity being at par or close to conventional coffee growings. There are a few, but those remain an exception. But for the majority of organic coffee farms around the world, the yields are 30 to 60% lower, with recent examples in Mexico, 44% lower than conventional coffee farm just next door, 33% lower in Nicaragua, 43% lower in Costa Rica. This is partially explained by the fact that organic coffee farms use a lot of shade trees, which in turn reduce the tree's opportunity to flower a lot and produce much cherry. This is explained by the extreme need to apply organic fertilizers on the plots of land, up to 2 tons for an organic farmer versus roughly 300 kilos for a non-organic farmer. But also we realized that one of the reasons why the yields are low is that the organic agriculture promotes the use of on-farm produced manure and compost, yet a majority of those farms, perhaps with the exception of small size ones in East Africa, the majority are just not self-sufficient enough on producing their own manure and compost, and therefore cannot spread it around the entire size of their farm. This yield aspect is made even worse when you take into consideration the fact that for, again, a vast majority of organic farmers in the world, there's always a percentage of their production that will be sold as non-organic. That's a sad reality, and for which those farmers will not be fetching high prices enough. And this, of course, hindering their total profitability as farming as a business. Another point that our farmers around the world have been telling us is the extreme intensiveness required in the labor process around growing organic coffee. Again, I mentioned earlier the amounts of organic fertilizers required being up to 6 times more than on conventional plots. Well, that's 6 times more labor, 6 times more passes through the fields. This also applies to everything else, to the mulching, to the pruning, etc., etc. So farming an organic plot of land is far more labor intensive than farming conventionally. And on top of that, it is now a fact that pickers around the world are favoring to go and work on non-organic farms because they will collect more coffee and have more money in their pocket at the end of the day. To remain on the agricultural point of view, one other aspect that the farmers have been telling us is the much lower resistance that their trees have versus pest and disease. If we now look at our next slide, more concerns that they are sharing with us, but that are not specifically related to the agricultural ones, is the more and more ease to market when it comes to non-organic fertilizers, which can represent very easily a temptation for the farmers. Very hard for them to resist that temptation to access a cheap, available just next door fertilizer, pesticide, weed fighter, which is either produced locally in the origin countries or which is imported from very cheap producing countries in Asia, noticeably. These produce look very genuine. They don't look very harmful. The security notice, the safety notice on the product is often very difficult to decipher. They very often bear familiar names such as bazooka, which you can see on the screen, karate, which is one that really made me laugh. Legend would be another one. So really, the fertilizer industry has made it more and more difficult for farmers to resist that temptation to access chemicals for their farms. Another point our farmer friends tell us about is the famous cost of certification, too often considered as a one-off and not enough often considered into their production costs. We will be looking later at the price construction for organic and fair trade organic coffees, and purposely, because it is a reality, cost of certification will not have been included in those. Lastly, there's a realization we've come across is that there's a big gap between the theory of local regulations and the reality as to how those local regulations are applied. International laws and, generally speaking, certification standards are not in practice protected by the local habits, the local way of applying the law. We now take a deeper look at origin with the case of Honduras, a cooperative called Cafico, which counts 300 members, which we source good amounts of coffee from, and with whom we've gone through the little exercise recently in preparation of this webinar of looking at their production and harvesting costs. It's well known to some of you that in Honduras, the referencing for land size is the manzana, which for those who don't know represents 0.7 hectares. In Honduras, the average coffee farm will count 7 manzanas and will produce 30 quintales, the local weight unit for coffee, which is almost 46 kilos, 30 quintales, of which 22 quintales will be a production of grade 1 coffee counting 12 defects. Hence, that's what the farmer can count on to make his money for the year, technically. The balance 8 quintales will be lower grades, sold at a discount, etc., etc. So when we did this little exercise with Sergio from Cafico, we first looked at the startup costs. Whether it would be for a farmer who's purely starting from scratch in the business or a farmer who wants to expand his land, the startup costs ranging from field preparation, sourcing the seedlings, preparing for planting, weeding the land, and fertilizing according to the organic standards. These startup costs on that volume for that size of land for the first 3 years represent more than the famous minimum fair trade organic price, 191.73 cents per pound. That's all good to look at a starting cost, you'll tell me, but if we consider it as a one-off and look on the long run, what's interesting to look at is the maintenance and the harvesting costs of the exact same average Honduran farmer. Those hike at a level of 114.92 cents, and this does not take into account the certification costs that we were talking about earlier. Let's now look at a bit more detail on the same topic. This price construction, still with the same cooperative, still talking to the same people in the cooperative, using a very realistic current market level of 110 on organic coffee, a differential of plus 42, you arrive at a grand total of 152 to the farmer gross, from which, once you remove the wet milling up to the drying costs of 12 cents, you remove the dry milling with the exporter and the exporter's margin, naturally, 24.12 cents. You then remove fees and taxes for a total of 13.25 cents. The net seller will have dropped from 152 to 102.63 cents per pound. And that's very much under the actual maintenance and harvesting cost of a farmer in Honduras. That's the sad reality in front of your eyes. Net seller minus cost per bag of those famous 22 quintales of grade 1, which are what the farmer can bank on technically, will create, in the current market conditions, at the current differentials for an organic coffee from Honduras, a net producer loss of 12.29 cents per pound. That same farmer today would need either a higher market or a differential at 54 over instead of 42 over to just break even, not yet talking about generating profitability. If we now look at fair trade organic coffee, in the same context, their ICE, the market level is replaced by the fair trade organic minimum price of 190. You have to deduce the 20 cents of flow social premium because that does not go in the pocket of the producer per se. You get a grand total, subtotal of 170. You apply the exact same costs from wet milling all the way to the taxes to be paid, etc. And you'll get a net seller of 120.63, which is a bit more comfortable already, thanks to the fair trade minimum price level, but will generate only 5.71 cents per pound profit to the farmer. Clearly, there's a need there to rethink the sustainability of such profit levels. Having looked at this price construction and the reality of origins based on what the farmers have been telling us, what role do we have to play? When I say we, I'm talking about the importers and the coffee roasters. What value can we add to the supply chain as of today? Well, we probably want to accept the fact that it's time to pay up for those coffees. It's time to pay up to ensure farmers can finally bridge that gap that I was showing you on the previous slide between their production costs and their profits. It's time to pay up to ensure ourselves we do get the supply of those coffees. Because quite clearly, without wanting to be alarmist on any level, would the situation continue like this, a farmer who loses up to 12 cents on every pound of coffee he sells will not be remaining in business. That's a clear fact. What else can we do at our level? Create awareness, create more and more awareness. Excuse me, we have a big role there to create awareness towards the final consumers. We'll be talking about the final consumers later in this presentation. I have quite some interesting facts and stories for you there, but we have a role there. We have a role to tell them how things are in origin, how their very desired organic coffee gets to them. And then we also have a very important role of creating awareness to the farmers. We see more and more farmers succumbing to that temptation of using chemicals. We see more and more farmers losing hope in growing coffee under the organic model. So we really have a responsibility there in making sure those farmers are aware that there is better demand than what they're actually meeting. There is potential to generate more profitability out of their farming. Another thing we need to start considering, and this is much more recent context, is the situation with the COVID-19. Will the millions of people who have lost their jobs around the world and continue to have to apply for unemployment, will those people downgrade to cheaper options of coffees? Yes, that's a big talk right now across the industry. People will continue to drink coffee. That's fantastic. Don't worry about the demand. The demand is there, but it will just be cheaper coffee. On the other hand, people are very, very sensitized now about sanitary risks, hygiene, and are more and more wanting to know what goes into their body. So there will also be, we believe, and we also don't believe it will be a niche, but we also believe there will be a chunk of the consumer population that will be demanding healthier options as a result of this current crisis. Having looked at what we think we should be doing on our side of the industry, let's now look at the actual prices, because that was the flashy title of our webinar today. So let's look at them. Let's look at them here. You see three charts, three graphs, which compile prices over the past 3 years from Honduras, from Congo, and from Peru for the main grades available from those origins. It doesn't need 1,000 explanations. You can clearly see that over the past 2 years, the differentials have been doubling up and quite quickly. Actually, since compiling this information, the differential for Honduras, both HG and SHG, have already taken another 5% hike. Let's now go on to the supply and demand, which I called here adjusted to glyphosate free. You might remember at the beginning of the presentation, me mentioning, excuse me for that, there we go. You might remember at the beginning me mentioning 7.2 million bags was our estimated supply of organic coffee around the world. Let's now put some perspective to that. Following the repetitive occurrences of findings of glyphosate on sample testing for the past 2 years across the industry, we became a bit concerned at Supremo and started running a very vast quantity of testing on all our origins, of which 4 I've used to demonstrate today. We have tested dozens and dozens of samples alongside our supply chain partners in origin. And if we look at the actual passing rate, the success rate of those samples coming back versus the maximum residue levels authorized in Europe, we will be, for this purpose, using Europe as a benchmark. So the maximum residue level in Europe, for samples from Peru, our passing rate was 67%. Honduras, 50. Mexico, 45. Uganda, astonishingly good, 86. You apply that passing rate to their actual organic production declared, and you will see that at the end of the day, you have from each of those origins, and from all the others that are not appearing on this slide, a much lower quantity of coffee available as genuinely organic, chemical-free. If you look at those 4 origins we took here, it jumps from 4.25 million bags of organic coffee available on paper to 2.46 million available glyphosate-free. That should already ring quite a few bells amongst the coffee community. You apply this passing rate of 57% on average to the world production I was talking about at the beginning, and you'll see that the optimistic 7.2 million bags is actually a safe 4.1 million bags. Is that enough to cover the demand, growing demand, and soon to be more expensive demand for organic coffee? Question mark for you guys. Sorry about that. Having a little sip of water here. Let's now look at the consumers. I've alarmed all of you with production figures. Let's look at the consumers. Meet Salima and Jack. I'll be talking to you about Salima and Jack, but what we see technically on the consumer side, having done some research, is a clear rise in awareness. Clear rise in awareness and 3 main pillars that people base themselves upon when replying to the question, why do you buy organic coffee? The first one is health concern. The second one is the environment. There's a strong belief out there that because it's produced organically, it's less harmful for the environment. It uses less chemicals, so it's better for the climate, etc., etc. And then the third pillar is a mix of different concerns around humans, which is the workers on the farms, and even some respondents stating animal welfare as a reason why they buy organic coffee. Fair enough. Let's now meet Salima and Jack. Today, both Salima and Jack are wearing masks because they realized at an early stage that the COVID virus was not a joke. Both Salima and Jack did not rush to the supermarkets to hoard on toilet paper and pasta when the crisis burst out. No, they are too clever for that. Salima is 26 years old. She's a copywriter in an ad agency, mid-size ad agency, and she's a committed climate activist. Salima does not own a TV, but she's a real Netflix addict. She drinks 3 coffees a day, and she's currently harassing the procurement guy at her office to start supplying organic coffee in their staff kitchen. Salima rides an electric scooter, and she favors the train over the plane for long-distance travels. Jack is a 32-year-old systems developer. He works full-time from home. He could very well pay rent on a nice apartment, but he has chosen to share accommodation with 3 of his peers. He says this fits his view of life and allows him to save plenty of money to travel the world. Jack is a pescatarian. He enjoys his direct trade red wine slightly chilled, and he drinks up to 6 cups of organic coffee every day. But he won't drink more than 2 if it's not organic. Because of how Jack and Salima have chosen to live their lives, it is actually okay that organic coffee is getting expensive. They both have intense social lives, but they will get married late. They will each have 1 child, perhaps none. Both Salima and Jack will probably never own any real estate, and this by choice. Salima and Jack favor buying clothes and appliances via second-hand applications on their phones, despite being very capable to afford the top brands in the shops. Both are frequent contributors to the Uber and Airbnb bottom lines. Both are concerned about our future, the future of the planet, and both doubt a lot in the political structures in place. Salima and Jack put the community needs before the individual ones. And last but not least, both Salima and Jack have very good disposable income, and they don't think twice when it comes to spending their money on organic products. But Salima and Jack are part of a much bigger picture. If we look at this chart from a research company, you'll see those categories of organic produce ranked based on their market attractiveness, consumer adoption willingness, and their growth rate per annum. So to put this in a more general context, organic food sales reached the $100 billion mark in 2018, just 2 years ago, and since then grew for 5.5%. Almost a little bit more than half of that is actually based in the US. The smaller half of that is based in the EU, with just Germany and France combined together representing $20 billion in 2019 of organic food and beverages. If you look at coffee on its own, coffee and tea, so organic beverages, the growing pace expected for 2020 to 2025 is circa 20% per annum. So the overall organic foods market grows at 5, 6, bit more maybe, percentages per annum, but the beverage category, and especially the warm beverage category, has a much higher growing rate. This puts things back in perspective, makes us all want to reflect around this thematic of today. I have extended my time a little bit, so what we'll do now is take a look if there are any questions, and I'll be answering to those. And I have no open questions, so what I suggest is to give you guys a minute or so, if you wish, to write me some questions on the icon there. Please feel free. Please feel free. I'll very happily reply to you. And thank you very much so far for listening. I have someone on the chat who is asking, will you share the presentation? Okay, yes, with pleasure. With pleasure, we'll be sharing the presentation. That's not a problem at all. I see who you are based on how you identified yourself, so you'll be receiving the presentation. And actually, I think it would be fair to say that everyone will be receiving the presentation. I will be using the same mailing list to share this presentation with you all. As we have no questions, I wanted to thank you all very much for attending today. We've just hit the half-hour mark. Had a bit more time for questions, but I'm sure this inspiring topic will probably lead to some questions in the future. Let me just very quickly give you my email address here on the last slide in case you do have questions. Please feel free to exchange further with me and with my colleagues on this topic. Once again, thank you very much for attending today. And if that's all for now, I will be stopping at this stage. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.